Somewhere in a forest right now, a bird just screamed, and everything heard it. A squirrel 3 trees over freezes mid-step. A deer lifts its head. A chipmunk vanishes into a hole. None of these animals are the same species. None of them make the same sounds. And every single one of them just understood exactly what that bird meant. Danger. Above you. Now. We like to think language belongs to us, that a dog and a cat sharing a house are basically two strangers who never learned each other's words, that the animal world is mostly noise, barks and chirps and growls flying past each other, meaning nothing to anyone outside the species that made them. But what if that's completely wrong? What if the forest is full of conversations happening constantly, out in the open, and we're the only ones who were never invited? Let's start with the simplest version of the question. Can an animal even tell another animal something specific? In 1980, two researchers named Robert Seyfarth and Dorothy Cheney went to Kenya to study vervet monkeys, and they noticed the monkeys didn't just make one alarm sound, they made three. One for eagles, one for leopards, one for snakes. And each one triggered a completely different response. Hear the eagle call, the monkeys look up and dive into the bushes. Hear the leopard call, they scramble up into the trees. Hear the snake call, they stand tall and scan the grass. The researchers proved it by playing recordings with no predator anywhere in sight. The monkeys reacted to the sound alone. These weren't screams of fear, they were closer to nouns. Okay, so animals can talk to their own kind. That part isn't shocking. Here's where it gets strange. They don't just talk to their own kind, they listen in on everyone else. In 2005, a researcher named Christopher Templeton studied the black-capped chickadee, a bird small enough to sit in the palm of your hand. Chickadees have an alarm call, the chickadee, that gives them their name. And Templeton found something hidden inside it. The number of D notes on the end wasn't random. It was a threat rating. A big, slow, clumsy owl got 2 or 3 Ds. A small, fast, deadly predator got up to a dozen. The birds were encoding the exact size of the danger into the call itself, and they weren't the only ones listening. Nuthatches, a completely different species, react to those calls too. More Ds, more caution. They crack the chickadee's code. They're not guessing. They're translating. It goes further. In Australia, a scientist named Robert McGrath spent years studying superb fairy wrens and found they respond to the alarm calls of other bird species living around them, not by instinct. They learn them. A fairy wren that moves into a new area picks up the local alarm vocabulary the way you'd pick up slang after moving to a new city. Different species, sharing one warning system because it keeps all of them alive, and the vocabulary can get disturbingly precise. For decades, a researcher named Kon Slobodchikov recorded the alarm calls of prairie dogs, small rodents nobody would ever suspect of having anything to say. What he found sounds invented. Their calls don't just mean predator. They appear to encode what kind: hawk, coyote, human, and details about it: the size, the color, how fast it's moving. In his experiments, prairie dogs produced measurably different calls for a person wearing a blue shirt versus a yellow one. A rodent, describing your outfit, to another rodent before you've taken 3 steps toward it. And this isn't some rare trick a handful of clever species stumbled into. It's everywhere. Ground squirrels listen to birds. Birds listen to monkeys. Monkeys listen to deer. Entire ecosystems are wired together by a web of borrowed warnings, a kind of shared emergency broadcast that no single species owns and every species can tune into. Step into any forest and you are surrounded by animals quietly reading each other all day in a language you were never told existed. Now, if different animals can genuinely understand each other, there's a dark consequence buried in that. Because the moment a message means something, it can be faked. Meet the fork-tailed drongo. It's a small black bird in the Kalahari Desert, and it is, functionally, a con artist. Drongos hang around meerkats and act as lookouts, giving real alarm calls when a hawk shows up. The meerkats come to trust them. And then, every so often, when a meerkat digs up a fat, juicy scorpion, the drongo screams a fake alarm. The meerkat drops the food and bolts for cover, and the drongo swoops down and steals the meal. A 2014 study by Tom Flower found the drongos even mimic the specific alarm calls of the very animals they're robbing and switch to a different lie when the first one stops working. Think about what that requires. You cannot lie in a language nobody understands. The drongo's entire con is proof that the conversation is real. For a long time, scientists refused to call any of this language. Language, the argument went, was ours. The one thing that made us different. What animals had were signals, reflexes, noise with a function but no meaning behind it. But that line has gotten harder and harder to hold, because a signal you can learn, modify, fake, and translate across species starts to look a lot less like a reflex and a lot more like a word. The debate now isn't whether animals communicate. It's how close what they're doing gets to what we're doing. And the honest answer is closer than almost anyone was comfortable admitting, because some species didn't just learn to understand each other, they learned to understand us. Here's a strange one. A dog can follow your pointing finger. You point at a cup, the dog goes to the cup. That feels too obvious to matter until you find out that chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, smarter than dogs by almost every measure, usually can't. They stare at your finger instead of where it's aiming. A researcher named Brian Hare tested this over and over, and dogs beat chimps every single time. Even wolves, dogs' own ancestors, struggle with it. Dogs didn't inherit that. They evolved it. Over tens of thousands of years living beside us, they developed the ability to read a human gesture, a glance, a point, a shift in your voice, the way they'd read another dog. They learned our language long before we ever tried to learn theirs. Which brings us to the one example that's almost impossible to explain any other way. In parts of Africa, there's a bird called the greater honey guide. It eats beeswax, but it can't break into a beehive on its own. Humans can, but humans are terrible at finding hidden hives. So the two of them struck a deal. The bird finds the hive. The human cracks it open. Both get paid. Here's the part that stops you cold. The people, the Yao honey hunters of Mozambique, call to the bird with a specific sound, a kind of brr-hum that's been passed down for generations. And in 2016, a scientist named Claire Spottiswoode ran the test. She played that exact call against random human sounds. When the hunters used the real call, the honey guide was more than twice as likely to show up and lead them to a nest. Sit with that for a second. A wild bird and a wild human, two species whose last shared ancestor lived over 300 million years ago, agreed on a password. Nobody taught it in a lab. They worked it out across generations, out in the open, because cooperating fed them both. That's not one animal understanding another. That's a negotiation. So, can different animals actually understand each other? The answer is yes. Yes, they can send specific messages. Yes, they can decode the calls of species that aren't their own. Yes, they can lie, learn, translate, and strike deals across the widest gaps evolution has ever carved. The forest isn't a room full of strangers shouting past each other. It's a crowded, constant conversation. Warnings, threats, bluffs, and bargains, running every hour of every day. And here's the part that should stay with you. We're standing right in the middle of it. And for almost all of human history, we assumed the silence was real, that the animals around us had nothing to say and no way to say it. But the silence was never theirs. It was ours. We just never learned to listen. And every year that we do, the wall between us and them gets a little thinner, and the forest gets a little louder. It was talking the whole time. You just weren't invited in yet.